The seminars are typically held like they are today on the first Tuesday of each month at noon. That's Hawaii time. Here at UH Manoa and online throughout the fall and spring semesters. So we typically take a break in the summertime. Those of you joining us here in person, see you've all grabbed some lunch. Please come in person if you want. If you're here at Manoa next time, we do provide lunch each time. And as you saw, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the PI-CASC website under news and events in a week or two. For those of you online with us, again, thanks for being here. We ask that you please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. We will have some time at the end following the presentation for questions and discussions. And feel free to leave any questions in the chat along the way, and we'll come to those at the end, or you can certainly chime in at the end, raise your hand in Q&A session. So with that, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Becky Ostertag, who will be sharing with us today on the climate resilience restoration, concepts and applications to the Pacific. Becky's also going to be joined by her graduate researcher, Kona Dancil, and I'll let Becky introduce Kona when he comes in a little later. Dr. Ostertag is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. That's why she's joining us online today. Her work focuses on understanding how tropical forests are structured and how tropical ecosystems function. She's conducted research in both Latin America and Hawaii. Her lab group works on a variety of ecological topics, including hybrid ecosystems as a restoration strategy, the HIPNet Climate Vegetation Hawaiian Forest Ecosystem Observatory, and impacts of invasive plant species, as well as nutrient cycling in tropical forests. Becky's graduate students have gone on to work at a number of places, including the USGS Pacific Islands Ecosystem Research Center, the Nature Conservancy, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, Kamehameha Schools, and among many other distinguished areas. Becky earned her PhD in botany at the University of Florida in Gainesville. So welcome, Becky. Go Gators, yes.
I never went to a football game my entire time there, so
okay.
I'm not very representative.
Well, welcome, Becky and Kona. Thank you very much for being here today. I'll pass it over to you and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here today and with Kona, and thank you so much for the invitation. Can everyone hear okay and everything's good?
Good, Becky, yeah.
Okay, great. This talk is related to a relatively new project supported by PI-CASC, and we're still getting some of the key details of the project underway. So I'm going to talk more generally today about background information on climate resilient restoration, different types of projects, and as well fill you in on our present activities. This PI-CASC award is collaborative and supporting graduate student Kona Dancil, who's here with me. And you're going to hear from him in part of the presentation today. The original proposal was written to PI-CASC, including myself, Jonathan Price from UH Hilo, Craig Blaisdell from Hawaii Army National Guard Environmental Program, Kalena Blakemore from OHA, Susan Cordell from Institute of Pacific Island Forestry, Cindy Dupuy from Hawaii Environmental Restoration, Natalie Kirishima, and Namaka Whitehead from Kamehameha Schools. But as we've been developing the project and forming the Lowland Wet Forest Working Group, these partnerships continue to grow. So this is an ongoing, more integrated project. We're in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and it's clear, I think we all know, that the world needs restoration now more than ever. The UN started the decade with a synthesis report shown on the right here, and that was to spur on a generation restoration movement with taglines like preventing, halting, and reversing the loss of nature, and that we need to restore our ecosystems now for climate, for nature, and for people. And I think we can all agree on that and the tremendous need for restoration. And I've also included on this slide the definition of restoration that the Society for Ecological Restoration put out in a 2004 report. Restoration has been looked at as one of the nature-based solutions to climate change, and this is spurred on large-scale efforts such as the movement towards forest landscape restoration, or FLR, which was codified in this 2012 book. And this forest landscape restoration movement, it's an ongoing process. Regaining ecological functionality is a big emphasis, and also enhancing human well-being across deforested and degraded landscapes. And FLR is a lot more than just planting trees. It's about restoring a whole landscape to meet present and future needs. And the idea is that landscape restoration offers multiple benefits and land uses over time. So this kind of thinking has led to new global initiatives, such as the Trillion Tree Campaign, to plant 1 trillion trees around the globe, and the Bond Challenge, which is to have large-scale forest restoration of many acres in the next 7 years now, or 6 years, by 2030. But these planting efforts do not always work. And there are some issues with planting of this trillion tree idea. And in some cases, that can even be harmful. And that's led some prominent scientists, and many of them were profiled in this article by Vox, to question some of these issues. And I like this quote from Karen Hull from UC Santa Cruz and Pedro Brancaleon from University of Sao Paulo. The vast sums of money on planting trees have the potential to transform landscapes and slow global warming, but will accomplish little if trees do not grow and survive. And what they bring up, and what this article brings up, is that there are many times when there are failures from this effort to just go out and plant trees that makes people feel good, but it doesn't always work. And some of the reasons for these failures are just inappropriate information and lack of planning, plants that were planted at the wrong time of year, so there's inadequate rainfall, or species that are poorly matched to climate conditions, and thinking of a species approach and not enough of the ecosystem level restoration approach. But then there's also some other really important things to point out. Sometimes there's very perverse incentives to clear land instead of maintain the forest. And some of this is related to cultural sensitivity. So there's examples where plantations have been created when what the local people really needed was grazing land, and not a lack of a recognition that some of those grasslands, particularly in tropical areas, can provide a lot of carbon storage, and can be equal or greater in some cases to the carbon storage in forests, and the need for the grasslands, as well as biodiversity and human livelihoods. There's also, in many cases, a lack of monitoring after these planting efforts, or the additional resources needed to take care of the trees to ensure their success. And that is really crucial. And then lack of accounting for climate change and other disturbances that might be happening. This is an old slide from an old book, but I still like it, even though some people don't, because I want to point out here the X and Y axis being ecosystem structure and ecosystem function. And you can see here this dot being the original ecosystem. The true definition of restoration, if you want to really get at what the word means, is to restore back to that original ecosystem. But in reality, most of us cannot do that. We're not living in the same world that we had decades or hundreds of years ago. We may not be able to harness all of the same natural processes. So most of us are doing some kind of rehabilitation, even though we call it restoration. And I think that's just important to keep in mind. It doesn't diminish the work that we're doing, but conceptually, you need to understand that when we say we're doing restoration, we're usually unable to restore back to the original ecosystem structure and ecosystem function. And also want to point out a new term that I've been seeing in the literature and hearing about now is, instead of restoration, is renovation. So that's a different kind of thinking about the mindset of what we are creating. So for the topic of climate resilient restoration, it's really important to point out that one of the more difficult parts of restoration is choosing the correct species to use. And it's often a value-laden process or difficult because we have lack of information. Not enough is known about the species ecology, its population genetics and local adaptations, things that are important about its physiology and adapting to the environment, and even evolutionary biology. And of course, these information gaps are confounded by climate change. We have uncertainty of how the climate is going to change, how that might interact with natural disturbances. And that kind of lack of information means that we're often making best guesses rather than rigorous science. And we need that rigorous science to determine what species mixtures might be best suited for adaptation to future climatic conditions. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this review paper by Simonson et al. In 2021, as they provide a detailed assessment of climate resilient restoration and a framework that I think can be very useful. And this quote is worth considering, so I'm going to read it. Some deeply embedded tenets of restoration practice break down in the face of widespread climate change impacts on ecosystems. For example, that local populations provide the best regeneration material, that natural regeneration and succession is the most desirable approach, and that management decisions are valid for decades to centuries. Upscaling climate change resilient restoration demands challenging these tenets and replacing them with scientifically underpinned approaches that are fit to meet future change and uncertainty. And that scientifically underpinned approaches, that's the background that we try to take. It's not perfect, and we value different people's opinions. And so we'd really, in the question and answer, like to hear your thoughts about these kind of approaches. But do feel like they're very important to move this forward to climate change adaptation so that we do our best to conserve the resources that we have, because restoration is expensive and very labor intensive. So in their paper, they developed this 7-step framework, and this framework was developed through literature searches, a literature survey, and interviewing experts to get at expert knowledge. And they looked at 118 projects that were part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and Brazil. So that was the area of the world where they were working to develop this framework. And of those 118 projects, only about a third referred to climate change. And of those total projects, only 5 really explicitly addressed the 7 steps that they put into this framework. And most of them only addressed 1 or 2. And so that led them to develop this larger scale framework of the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about if we want to do climate resilient restoration. And I wanted to spend a little bit more time on this and talk about some of the different considerations that go along with each step. So in the first step, when considering climate uncertainties, many restoration studies choose objectives based on historical conditions, and that's important. But that's not always going to work in a world where we know now that we have to adapt to climate change. So we also have to consider that novel ecosystems have formed in some places, and we might have to work with some of those novel species elements. Or we might have to realize that we need restoration objectives that can be adaptive and that are especially focusing on ecosystem functioning. And of the steps, I think this one is so important because the restoration objectives define the whole project. And one way that you can look at restoration, especially if you want to do climate resilient restoration and have a lot of planning involved in your project, is to think of it in a way as reverse engineering. As an engineering approach, what are the steps we need to meet these objectives? And so that objective defines everything that you do. The second step here, selecting sites. We need to anticipate climate change, and we also need to anticipate some kind of connectivity that might occur under that climate change. How is that going to affect the movement of individuals? Will climate change influence the movement of genes within or among populations? Is it going to influence invasive species' ability to come into new areas and their distributions? How will climate change interact with vulnerability to threats or with drivers of habitat degradation and loss? So fire is a key thing that I think about here in this site as well. We need to be anticipating, and that also goes with step number 5. The third step, accounting for future distributions and fitness when choosing target species and their ecosystems. We know that local genetic material is often the preferred choice, but if we're in a rapidly changing environment, it's possible that that local provenance could be poorly adapted for new environmental conditions. So Prober et al. In their paper suggests that we might need a climate adjusted provenance strategy. And Simonson talk about in this paper that we need to look for maladaptation at this step. We need to think about introduced species that might be in or could come into these ecosystems and their genetic variability. And we need to think about if we're underestimating or have the potential to underestimate climate change variation and extreme events. The fourth step here in terms of key interactions and climate niches is important to think about. We might have to take approaches where we have to do some kind of manipulations to allow for the interactions. For example, in working in wetlands, wetland water levels may have been highly altered, and manipulations might need to be put in place to readjust those water levels. It's just one kind of example that could occur at this step. At the 5th step here, site level climate risks, we have to identify as much as possible. Things like fire, biological disturbances, invasion, pests, extreme events, physiochemical changes. And of course, we're never going to be able to identify them all because we've all been working in these systems and know that surprises happen. But the more we can think about and plan for them, the more we can have a mindset to be more climate resilient. The 6th step here, align the project with long-term policies, synergies that seek multiple objectives. This can be often at a larger scale, but if the project might align with REDD+ for carbon sequestration, how can stakeholder land management be part of the project? The Gondwana Link project in Australia looks at joint mitigation, adaptation, and development. Concurrently, in New Zealand, the Cities, Nature, and People project is working on urban restoration, and maybe projects could align to some of their objectives. So looking at that kind of scale can be important. And then the last one here is the monitoring. We can't underestimate the importance of monitoring, and yet most projects only monitor for a few years, and a lot of that is funding and manpower. But really, we're talking about restoration projects that take decades to centuries to get the kind of benefits, the long-term benefits that we're really seeking. So this is another review paper that I just briefly want to touch on. They identified different attributes that explicitly related to climate change, and they classified them as individual, population, community, ecosystem, or process level attributes. And I'm not going to go through all 45 different attributes, but I just want to show a few of them at the ecosystem level and the process attributes level. To mention here, so the first column is if it's influencing resistance, and the second column is if it's influencing climate change resilience, and the third column is the number of studies that they found. And things that are not often thought about in restoration projects, at least in some of them, might be related to things like food web complexity or the connectivity between different habitats. Are these process attributes like energy flows and groundwater contributions and disturbances. And we really need to think about some of these things. Obviously, none of us can do all of these things, but the more that we put this into our mindset, the more we can think long-term about how to be adaptive to climate change when we're doing restoration. And the timing and the environmental variability are also important. So people often think we'll just plant trees. With the global crises that are affecting us, these tree planting campaigns are things that politicians and the public can really get behind, making them feel good. But our argument here is that we do need to have a careful study and a planning process, and that's I'm going to describe what we're doing in our project. And I wanted to just quote, this comes from that earlier Vox article that I showed, quote Robin Chasden, who's a researcher at the University of the Sunshine Coast and one of the premier scholars in forest succession and restoration ecology. And she says, people often think we'll just plant trees and call that a restoration project and we'll exonerate our carbon sins. But that often fails. And so our project in Hawaii that we wanted to share with you today is a two-tiered approach for designing climate resilient restoration. And the first approach is using species distribution models, taking that ecological niche modeling. It's building upon the work of Lucas Fortini et al. In their 2013 General Technical Report, and trying to understand the present and future geographic range of key species that could be used in restoration. So on the right here is an example from Fortini et al. For Ohia, and showing that there's some areas that will be lost under climate change. There's some areas that could be gained, and there's overlapped areas. And this is one way to look at how a species distribution could change and how can we use that information for restoration. We want to focus not on the areas where the species is likely to be lost, but on those areas that could be gained or those overlap areas. And then the second part of the approach is that after we have species which we think could be appropriate to adapt to future climate change, then using functional traits to build a balanced community of species based on trait space. So on the right here, showing work that we did in the Liko Napolina project, looking at lowland wet forest restoration on Hawaii Island. And we started out with 29 candidate species that we thought could be appropriate to be put into this habitat for restoration. And we measured 15 different traits related to how species use water, nutrients, height, seed mass. So getting at growth, survival, and reproduction. And we put that in a principal components analysis. And one of the first steps then that we did is then we started to narrow down the species list. So this cluster in the middle here, these species are all pretty similar in their traits. So each number is a different species. It doesn't matter in this case what species is what. But we can not necessarily need to use all these species because they're relatively similar. So can we cut some of these out in this area? In down here, these were both tree ferns. So we really only needed one tree fern in our project. So we could cut one of these out and use this kind of iterative process to narrow down the list. That's one part of it. But the second part of it is use this iterative process to develop a balanced community where the different species are spread out in trait space. So they're representing different ecological niches. And ecological theory predicts that a more functionally diverse community will be more resilient to change. So that's the second part of the methods that we would use in this kind of approach. And we're focusing as a focal habitat in Hawaiian lowland wet forest, especially the area on the northeastern side of Hawaii Island, where we've been working for a long time. This slide shows pre-human contact with the lowland wet forest and post-human contact. This pinkish color are non-native dominated areas. And we know that these lowland wet forests are in critical need of restoration. They only exist in small remnant patches. They have large issues with highly invasive plant and animal species. And importantly, our work has shown that restoration is possible. We've done it in different ways, but it is very difficult and labor intensive. And we haven't in the past really thought about how to incorporate climate change in what we've done. So this is an evolution of now incorporating climate change in this kind of work. And we started with a process of engagement, reconstituting the lowland wet forest working group, which now has 25 people in it and represents managers and scientists and independent citizens. And we're committed to helping and work with managers, collaborating to develop restoration prescriptions for different sites. So these are the sites that we have represented in our group right now. And we've been working as a group to visit over the last year since we started to visit some of these sites and learn from each other what the challenges we face, what are some of the key ecosystem attributes of the different sites, what are some of the species that we may want to use for restoration. And our objectives are to use the scientific method that combines the species distribution modeling and the functional traits to provide a potential species list for each site. So in our first meeting, which happened in February 2023, 2024, 2023, forget what year it is, a year ago, we came up with a list of 24 possible species. And we're focusing on native and indigenous species that are found. So these species are native to Hawaii, but they're found elsewhere. So we can look at their climate distributions outside of Hawaii and predict if they can live in areas of Hawaii where they may not currently be living now. And this also includes Polynesian introductions, which do have distributions elsewhere as well. So we can look at the climate conditions and environmental conditions of where they're living around the globe and see how they could be matched up in Hawaii to future climate change conditions. So the core idea is that some areas in Hawaii may be able to support these taxa, even if they're not currently in these areas or they're not in the abundance in these areas. And there's few examples right now of this combined approach, but I did want to point out this one recent paper by Fremont et al. So we're starting with a focal species as a sort of a pilot analysis, Sidrax odorata or alahe'e. And I'm gonna turn it over now to Kona Danso. He's been working on this pilot analysis. Kona comes from the island of Maui, and he did his undergraduate degree at Evergreen State College in Washington, and he is a master's student here at UUH Hilo in the Tropical Conservation Biology and Environmental Science program. So I'm going to pass it on to Kona now for a little bit.
Thanks so much, Becky. Hello, everyone. So yeah, just jumping right in for the pilot analysis, we just wanted to go in with alahe'e. Chose this species because those who are familiar, this is a really easy species to propagate in the greenhouse. It's described as a medium-sized tree with fragrant white flowers as a relative of the coffee family, found in dry to moist shrubland forests at elevations up to 2,700 feet throughout the tropics. Ecologically and culturally, it's a very significant species. It provides important subcanopy for our native grasses and other native herbaceous species. And so how this species distribution model is going to work. Just like Becky mentioned, because it's indigenous, we have it occurring across the globe. So I'm able to go ahead and grab global data points to find where it's persisting on its own naturally, which I'll get into more detail later. And using that, and with some key environmental variables, identify what its suitable habitat range is going to look like in that step 2, and use that climate information from all over the tropics and forecast it here in Hawaii. And once that map is created for Hawaii Island, or even anywhere in the state of Hawaii, we can use the habitat suitability to help identify, is this a good restoration species for this location on this island? And so where I'm getting my data points from, real quickly, the bottom figure is the GBIF data point occurrences across the globe, but I'm also getting them from iNaturalist, which iNaturalist is an open source citizen science website that takes 3 collaborative individuals to say, yes, that species is occurring there. But I also make sure to take all of these data points with a grain of salt, because incidents happen, people make mistakes, whether that's a geo-reference mistake or a species identification mistake. I want to make sure that the data I'm getting is reliable, and that's something that I account for in my later steps. But generally, we can see, figure on the left is kind of what you can see with iNaturalist. You can barely make out in the ocean. The light green points outside of Oahu are points where people on iNaturalist say alahe'e is occurring, and we can obviously immediately remove those from the data set. And also, I'm very fortunate that GBIF, as well as iNaturalist, takes the alahe'e data points and has a column for cultivated individuals. Cultivated individuals can occur under heavy management in areas where environmental variables are skewed. So I don't want any of those values where it's occurring in a desert situation, but somebody's watering it. So it's important that I exclude any cultivated individuals. And then species specific, alahe'e likes to go to the coastline in some areas. So just to account for coastal groundwater grouping, I'm doing a coastal buffer across all of its native country ranges of 300 meters. And this is going to be a step I take that is species specific based on different species from our 24 species list. So what I am using for the data information and the layer information, or for the layers specifically in ArcPro, is the world bioclim layers, which have a very high resolution scale. But the 4 variables I'm most interested in that my committee and I decided would be mean annual temperature, temperature seasonality, which is represented as the maximum and minimum monthly temperature found at that georeference data point, and mean precipitation and minimum and maximum difference precipitation. And then for Hawaii, so we get more accurate resolution values, I'm using rasters from the geography department at UH Manoa and UH Hilo for the climate atlas of Hawaii and the rainfall atlas of Hawaii. And then, yes, important to note, the global cell size is 340 kilometers for the bioclim layers, which means there's a lot of potential for skewed data points to be there. One example that just comes to mind is in Papua New Guinea. We have data points occurring at the bottom of high mountain ranges where the temperature is skewed lower than is actually representative of the sample. But I take that into account in this step. So once we start looking at the values For the range and for what I'm going to plug into the habitat suitability model, I only want values that are 2 standard deviations away from the mean. And so that excludes a lot of the major outliers from data points, which very fortunate that Alahe is persisting pretty well throughout the tropics. I'm about my N is just over 4,000, so I have a very large sample size. So doing this step, we can exclude a large majority of those dangerous, questionable outliers. But I'll also show this visually in the next slides. For rain in annual precipitation, minimum, it tends to tolerate about 370 millimeters per year, and then maximum is about 1,600 millimeters per year. And temperature is much more large range for 13 degrees Celsius per year, and 27 degrees Celsius per year at the top. And so how this looks visually, I'll just start with temperature. Nothing too surprising here in Hawaii. The alpine and subalpine areas are not going to support Alahe, which does not come to a surprise. In green, I have the 1 standard deviation from the mean represented, and in blue is 2. And so what this indicates is, with a grain of salt, green could indicate preference and blue could indicate tolerance. But of course, I need to do more analysis about weighting the data points in a further analysis. And then this is where the interesting trends start to come. So again, in green is preference and in blue is tolerant, vaguely. So there is a lot to pick apart here. I mean, for those who are familiar, here on Big Island, Hilo is renowned for its constant rain. And from data like this and the global data occurrences, I would suggest that this should not be a key restoration species in parts of Hilo and the Northeast lowland wet forest. And you can see that on the coast of Hana on Maui as well. These areas of high rainfall, Alahe, just will not love and really should not persist on their own wild based on global data occurrences.
Okay, and thank you, Kona. So the next steps, Kona is going to be working more on finalizing this filtering process for the geographic data and developing a working model that can be replicated with each species. He's playing with Maxent right now, but running into some difficulties with that, with overfitting. We're going to collect functional trait data for each species. We haven't fully decided on what traits we're going to use yet, and going to be involved in doing the PCA analysis. And then, of course, working with the collaborators at each site to narrow down the species list, and one that's going to be appropriate for the biological conditions and constraints, but also for the people working at each site, their cultural and human socioeconomic conditions and constraints as well. But there's some caveats that I really want to emphasize here. One is that the species list that's going to be generated should be considered a hypothesis. There's no guarantee that by putting these species together in this mixture, they're going to be successful. There's an implicit assumption here that the genetic diversity, the local adaptations, and the functional trait values of the indigenous and Polynesian plants, that we're getting the information from their other locations is going to be appropriate here for Hawaii. And we don't know that, so that really does need to be tested. There's also the assumption that goes into this that species might have the same environmental drivers across their distributions, but some that may not be true. Some populations may be more affected by an environmental driver like rainfall, and other populations may be less affected by that environmental driver. And these models give individual or environmental variation averages for a species, but they're not really considering the environmental and individual differences. So think about it like health data. When we get information about what our risk is of certain health factors, that's taking on maybe the average male of a certain race of a certain age. This is your risk factor. But there's a lot of given variation among people. So you don't freak out just because you fall in that demographic that you're going to die of this disease, right? Because you know that there's variation involved in that. And that same kind of thing is going on for the species in these kind of modeling exercises. Some more caveats is that we're making these based on distributions and not performance data about growth and survival. And honestly, that really would be the best of what you really would want to know is how well do these different species do in these different environments. And most of these data points come from adult individuals. So we don't have much information on the life stage. Are the conditions that adults are found under the same kind of conditions that really are best for seedlings or saplings? We don't really know that. Another issue that is inherent with this kind of work is, are we looking at the right variables? So for climate, we're focusing on temperature and precipitation, but maybe they need to be sliced in a finer way. Maybe it's more seasonality that we should be looking at during dry periods or things like that, or other climate variables. And the same thing with functional traits. Functional trait studies ask a lot of questions about what functional traits should be used. And there's kind of a consensus developing on some common ones that many people use. But in all honesty, a reason why many people use those common ones is those are the ones that are easy to measure. But those might not be the most important for performance. And finally, climate is not the only environmental characteristics that could be shared among these species looking for these distributions. This approach doesn't look at soils or microtopography or those important biotic interactions that are going to be occurring relative to herbivores and pollinators, diseases, mutualisms in terms of the mycorrhizae or nitrogen fixing associations. All of those things we know on the ground are important for understanding and managing ecosystems. So in conclusion, we're talking about an approach for climate resilient restoration using scientific tools, and we think it has the potential to expand our restoration choices and explicitly include climate change, which is something that a lot of past restoration efforts haven't really done, thought about it, but hasn't been an explicit part of the step in terms of this climate adaptation. But this planning approach definitely needs field testing to deal with these many assumptions and uncertainties. In the meantime, the Lowland Wet Forest Working Group continues to explore different sites and learning from each other. And we are planning on writing some kind of document, getting it written down about what are the best management practices, what have we learned, what can we share of working in this kind of system. And we're hoping that we can put this somewhere where it will be available for the general public, especially landowners, many of whom might have little patches of this forest in their yards or want to restore areas to this kind of habitat type. So I want to acknowledge PI-CASC for funding, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also contributed to this project. And thanks Sharon, Scott, Jeff, and Tim for their various advice and work on this. And thank the members of the Lowland Wet Forest Working Group. And if you're interested in joining us, we're very open, and just contact us and let us know. And wanted to say thank you. And I think we definitely have time for questions. We're really interested in hearing your thoughts about these approaches, what could be learned, and any kind of comments or questions that you all have. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Becky and Kona. We do have some time for questions. I see a couple in the chat already. So why don't we go to the chat and we'll come back to the room for any questions here. Becky, you probably can access the chat, but I'll go ahead and read the questions as well so everybody else can
Okay.
actually. First one comes from Kyle DeHelig. You showed a lot of different map overlays, different data overlays. Kyle's wondering, is there a cultural overlay that's utilized when deciding where plants might be selected?
Yes, that's a big part of that cultural overlay is working with the lowland forest working group and having the different managers at the site say what species they want to use and might be appropriate for them. So they're important in determining that species list, and many of our species do have culture components, so that there's a lot of the canoe plants, which many of them have important cultural uses, of course. Those cultural uses of certain species at certain sites might take more importance. So yes, there's definitely a cultural overlay because the species choices are not just what's biologically possible, but what people might want at their sites or not want.
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat, and we'll come to the room, from Uma. How do you choose which climate model to apply to the species distribution models?
You want to take that one, Kona?
Yeah.
And there's a second part to that. Are functional traits for Hawaii native plants available in an existing database? Or are you measuring them all for each species yourself?
Great. I'll let Kona answer the first one about the climate model, and then I can answer the functional trait one.
All right.
Yeah, so for the climate model, that's a decision that my committee and I made, but ultimately accessibility, the world bioclimate layers are publicly available for anyone to grab and toy with. And they're reliable, even though the cell resolution size is large, it's still reliable. So again, it's just about accessibility and being able to use it, because I'm planning on doing this process with 20 plus species. So I want to make sure I can streamline it with files that I trust that I can reuse. And then in Hawaii, same thing, just using a more updated cell or accurate resolution file to make sure that the Hawaii data points are solid, and just choosing that based on what I was recommended and what previous papers used, like Lucas Fortini's and Jonathan Price's.
Okay, and then related to the functional trait question, very exciting is that with Hawaii EBSCOR NSF funded project, one of the things that we're involved in, Casey Barton at UH Manoa is also help leading this up. And Monty Belcade is the data scientist working on the project. I'm involved in this and several others. We are working on developing functional trait databases that will be publicly available for Hawaii. So compiling all the information that is out there. Done quite a bit of measuring on some of these species already. Some still need to be done. We're going to be taking all that publicly available, all the published data, and making it available for the state in a publicly available database. So it's not all available yet, but it will be. And I think that's a really important tool in doing this kind of restoration. And I am really interested in building up and getting as many species as possible. So if anyone's interested in this, talk to me more, because I think it's really key data that we need for the state.
Great, thank you. I do see another question in the chat, but let's go to the room, see if there's any questions here. We'll come back to the chat. Anybody? Okay, let's go back online. This comes from Julie Denslow. What are your concerns for the use of non-native species to provide missing ecosystem services?
Okay, yeah, great question. The non-native species in our list are the Polynesian introduction. So one of the advantages of using those plants is that they've generally been in Hawaii for a longer period of time. And so they probably have some level of adaptation to the environment here. but we don't know for sure, you know, the higher level functionings of those ecosystem services. Some of it's being tested in a restoration project that we're involved with. That I'm involved with, the Lico Napolina project, but certainly there's other aspects that we don't know about, and so it is a concern. However, you have to balance that. These low elevation areas now, where restoration could be done, are completely dominated by highly invasive species. And so the attempt to do restoration to get them back to native and this non-native, non-invasive species in this hybrid ecosystem, we feel is likely going to provide more quality ecosystem services than the present condition. So it's a balance. It's definitely not perfect. In an ideal world, it's not necessarily what you would want to do, but we are kind of in a critical situation here in Hawaii. And so that's kind of the thinking that goes behind that.
See a couple more questions in the chat. I'm trying to keep a side eye out for the room. If we have any questions here, just go ahead and raise your hand. Also, folks online, yeah, feel free to add the questions that you have into the chat. We also welcome you to come on screen and raise your hand too. If you want to go ahead and deliver your question in person online. So question from Chris Heron. Why look for Polynesian introductions as a possibility for potential species? Was there any consideration of finding local genotypes found in analogous microclimates, which represent warmer future scenarios?
Okay, good question. One of the issues is, so we're not at this stage genotyping or looking for the genotypes. We're kind of looking at the species level. So that is definitely an issue here. I think once these recommendations are made, then it needs another step of being tested in the field and looking at those genetic components. But one of the issues with working in the low elevation forests, which are our most disturbed areas, is that we don't really have analogous climates of anything warmer, right? They're like at the lowest elevation, they're just going to get warmer. So we don't have other areas that are warmer in Hawaii to compare them to. So thus we're looking outside of Hawaii to elsewhere in the Pacific, or where they're growing, where in other places. So something like kukui can grow in warmer climates than we have here in Hawaii. And so looking at the environmental conditions under where it's growing elsewhere can tell us what its possibilities are under potential climate change in Hawaii. And we don't have a warmer area here within the state to really compare to. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks, Chris. If there's a follow-up to that, go ahead and chime in at any point. But yeah, thank you, Becky. I'm gonna, oh, I see a hand in the room. Yeah, go ahead, Beth. Yeah, get your microphone.
I'll just come over here. Thanks so much for that wonderful talk and overview. As we're thinking about restoring or renovating our wetland forests, one of the questions I have is, here in Hawaii, we have such a history of trauma and mismanaged lands.
Yeah.
So in terms of how do you account for mismanaged lands, restoring systems back to what they should be in terms of water cycles, stream restorations, water flow, as an example, such as on like neglected ag land. But then you have that overlay of climate change occurring. So in terms of what can happen locally in a more ethical local management, preparing our natural resources in our forests, and then you have then that larger context. Just curious how you account for that.
It's very hard. I think the people that can account for that best are the local stewards at those sites that have seen that and worked there. Understanding as much as we can about these different species and the ecosystem services they can provide, whether it's a need for shade, how much species influence soil fertility. Those kinds of things are really important. And I think that's like the first step, is to try to identify what species may provide the services that are missing or degraded at the site first, and then asking these climate change questions and saying, well, will these species likely to be a good investment under climate change scenarios, or are they kind of at the edge of their range and not going to be doing well under future environmental conditions? And at that same point, that's when also you have to deal with the community needs. So starting from the very get-go, including species that are important to people, or excluding species that have problems and are not going to be acceptable. All of that, I think, has to start like at a really early stage. And I don't think we have like a clear pathway forward. I think we'll just have to work with the best information we have, and the local stewards at a given site, I think, are the first place to start.
Thank you so much, Becky.
Thank you. I see one more question from Uma and Nagendra in there. I want to make a couple announcements real quickly, and Uma will come back to your questions if that's okay. Before people log off, I just want to make sure you're all aware of our next upcoming seminar, which will be Tuesday, March 5th at noon, our next Slice of PI-CASC seminar with Melissa Iwamoto, Jordan Watson, and Megan Hattori, our friends from the Pacific Islands Ocean Observing System, or PACIUS, who will be presenting on their program Backyard Buoys, Community-Led Ocean Observing Across the Pacific, and more. So please join us next month for that. And then as you're logging off, folks, there'll be a survey that pops up. If you have an idea for a future seminar, please share that in the survey as you're logging off. And then you'll also see emails for upcoming seminars coming, but do also check in with our PI-CASC website if you want to check about under our events page about upcoming seminars. So Becky, Kona, let's go back to you for one more question.
Sure.
This one's from Uma again. In your functional trait PCA, do you find empty trait space where there are missing ecosystem roles? If so, what would you consider doing for that?
Yes, we have seen that, and some other data that we have with different projects has shown that sometimes that's where you can see invasive species coming in those missing roles. But again, it's hard because you don't know something's missing until you see. I don't know. It's very tricky. So I'm not really sure what to consider doing, except trying to balance the trait space as much as possible with your species choice. But even that, there's always potentially like an axis that could be spread further. So there's no really easy answer for that question.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this excellent work. And I hope maybe we can check in with you again in a year or two for another seminar as this
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. Then we'll have a lot more to talk about.
Oh, no, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Another round of applause for Becky and Kona.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. All right. Aloha, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Aloha, mahalo.